course Basic Cognitive Processes. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. The title of today's lecture is Modularity and Cognitive Neuropsychology. In today's lecture, we will talk about the approaches towards modularity, the concept of what modularity is, and we will also talk about how the field of cognitive neuropsychology helps us understand the relationship between the mind and the brain. Just to take a brief stock of what we have been doing till now, we know what the definition of cognitive psychology is, the fact that it is a scientific study of the mind and mental processes. We also have looked in the last lecture about the various approaches that have been taken to understand the relationship between the mind and the brain. In this lecture, basically we will talk about this issue of concept of modularity, which was given by Jerry Fodor, and we will try and see how this helps us in understanding the architecture of the human mind. We will also talk about how this field of cognitive neuropsychology, which is basically a field that attempts to understand the damaged brain, or which basically attempts to take stock of how different cognitive disorders give us a peek into the workings of the human brain. Now, one of the central concepts that I will be talking about in today's lecture is the concept of modular design. Now, David Marr in 1982 actually put forward this concept as the principle of modular design, and he advanced this argument in terms of an example of a computer program, and basically he talked about how a particular programmer who is basically given the task of designing a large and a complex computer program will go about this task. Let us say there is somebody whom we have asked to write a large program. Let us say the program has to do the tasks of let us say a simple task of letting us understand what are the different objects, what are the different shapes in the visual environment. Now, that particular program would basically have to have subcomponents. Okay. As any typical program, let us say for example there is a program of a library, you have to really write a program that basically functions as a library. So, it should allow you to issue books, it should allow you to register books that are returned and those kind of things. Now, any such program, if you want the program to do some mental activity like looking and seeing shapes, or a typical computer program whom you want to really just use as a library program, will both need to have subcomponents. We have talked about this in the car engine example in one of the previous lectures. Today we will also try and see how that example can be applied to understanding of this human mind and brain interaction. Now, the central idea in this principle of modular design that David Marr gave was the idea that we need to break down this overall endeavor, if this overall large program should be broken down into smaller components, each of which do a particular task and each of which are connected to each other in possible ways that help this task to get completed. Okay. These are the things we really want to do here. Now, let us try and apply this to the human mind, how the human mind, how does this model apply to the human mind. Jerry Fodor basically takes this approach to this course, the goal of understanding the human mind. Okay. So, Jerry Fodor basically takes this to about how to understand the functional architecture of the human mind. He puts forward something called the modularity hypothesis, the idea that the minds may be decomposed into smaller and discrete sub processes and modules. Now, again coming back to this example of the program. Now, this program basically can be divided into these separate modules or subroutines that can be developed independently of the program. To those of you who may be familiar with how writing of programs and testing of programs work, might know that if there is a big program or a big code, a 5,000 line code or a 10,000 line code you have to write, there are people who actually undertake the writing of these sub modules. Okay. And then what is done is basically all these sub modules are integrated in a single program and implemented as if this was just one program which completes the task which is asked of this program to complete. Okay. So, say for example with very large software packages like the Microsoft Office, or say for example the Windows and those kind of things, each of these subroutines will have a dedicated set of programmers who collectively work and just work on one particular subroutine. Now Marr basically wrote this with respect to large and complex computer programs. His points can actually be applied to how we think of the functional architecture of the mind as well. Say for example, if mind is can be thought of as a simple program that helps us process all this information that we get from the entire from this environment around us and all of these possible outputs that we generate, then we can actually think of many sub modules. Say for example, if you're walking in a park, you are actually seeing undergoing a variety of experiences. You're smelling a lot of odors of these different flowers, and you would want to recognize them. You are navigating a path and you would want to walk without bumping into anybody. You might also want to think and decide on some things. So the point is, you will at least need 3 different modules to be doing these things. You would need a module that processes odor and helps you recognize the odor, the object to which this odor belongs to. You would also say, for example, want to have a proper navigational component which will help you walk in this park without bumping into others. And you would want to have a a particular decision making kind of a module that helps you decide and ruminate on whatever happened during the day and decide, say for example, whether the day was a good day or a bad day, these different kinds of things. So you can take this example and this principle of modularity that David Marr forwarded and apply it to how the mind really works, to understand what the functional architecture of the human mind might be. Now, according to Marr, there are actually very clear advantages to having this modular design. Okay, in having a complex system, divided into these sub processes, specialized sub processes. Let us talk about what these advantages could be. Now, one of the particular advantages of having a system like this, or having this large system broken down into sub-components or modules as David Marr would have it, has the very important advantage that this makes the system resistant to damage. Now, for example, if there is one large computer program and you would want to make a change to one of the lines of this 10,000 line program, and the point, it is very possible that if it is just indeed one single program, that changing one line, let us say line number 2501, will actually change some things for this entire program. So you would want to really avoid that kind of a scenario. For that, what programmers do is they actually have used these different modules. So if you have to change something in a module, it has consequences for that module itself. Okay, and in that sense, you have a system which will not break down if, say for example, one module is non-functioning, everything else kind of functions pretty much in the same way. Okay, so say for example, so this is something which can be explained that our program, if it is divided into subcomponents, makes this resistant to damage, any kind of damage for that matter. Okay. On the contrary, also, say for example, if this program is composed of these independent routines, it is also possible to see that damage to one of these components does not create a problem for all the components or the entire output of this entire program. Now, applying this view to the human mind, or applying this view to the architecture of the human mind, what can be said is that these sensory transduction processes, the human senses, the eyes, the nose, the ears, basically each of these sense organs, what it does, whatever information it receives, that is converted into some kind of an information that is usable by these senses by the process which is called sensory transduction, it eventuates in information being transformed into a common perceptual code. Say for example, there is some information coming from the eyes, there is something you are hearing, and there is something, say for example, you are touching. Okay. So, these 3 sensory inputs will all be converted into a particular perceptual code, which will be the common code on which all of these other processes will work. So, all of these different sense organs will actually convert their information into something of a common perceptual code, and this basically is rendered to and this common perceptual code can actually be worked on by the higher cognitive processes like decision making, memory, etc. Okay. This code then and how does this really get evaluated by these higher cognitive processes? Marr says that this code is then operated on in sequence by the faculties of perception, imagination, reasoning, memory, etc. and each of these faculties they basically affect their own intrinsic operations upon this set of input representations. Okay. So, what was the different sources of information, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the skin, all of them give you different kinds of information. You convert it into a common perceptual code, and then this common perceptual code is worked on by these different higher cognitive abilities like memory, like language if you want to talk about it, say for example reasoning if you want to decide something about it. Okay. And each of these processes work on this in their own special way. Okay. And in some sense irrespective of each other. Say for example, that was the idea that David Marr was saying, that the linguistic code for or the linguistic operation on a particular kind of information will happen independently of the perceptual processing that will happen, or independent of the memory operation that will happen. Now, in that sense it kind of can be a good thing or a bad thing. We will discuss this in more detail as we move ahead. Finally, in this way David Marr actually was also particularly taken with this principle of modular design, because it allowed for a degree of operational independence. Memory does not need to depend on perception, reasoning does not need to depend on memory. It could just operate logically by its own, it does not need to take information from the memory. Now, the point is, here is where a bit of a disagreement with modular design already starts creeping in. Okay. So, the whole idea is that this is also something, say for example, if you want a rather efficient system can be useful. It might be a good thing, let us say, let us assume that memory does not depend on perception, or reasoning does not depend on your memory, those kind of things that David Marr was talking about. And the idea is that in this very complex information processing system, that is the mind, these different modules can be getting on with their own tasks quite independently of each other and quite independently of what is happening in the other parts of the brain. Okay. So, this is what David Marr meant when he was talking about this modular design. Now, it already starts feeling a little bit counterintuitive, but be with me as we go through this whole concept of why modularity was proposed, and as we go ahead in later lectures of this course, we will evaluate whether we can apply this principle of modularity to the way actually cognitive processing takes place, because this was something which was given way back in 1982. We know a lot more about how cognitive processing or how the mental functions operate now, and in hindsight we can actually in that sense evaluate whether this was a correct way of assuming how the mental architecture would be. Okay. So, for now we will just discuss what basically David Marr had proposed. Now, so too much with Marr for now. Let us move to some other way in which modularity has been thought of. So, one of the other very popular formulations of modularity was given by Jerry Fodor, and Jerry Fodor basically in 1983 forwarded something which is known as the modularity hypothesis. Jerry Fodor basically began by discussing what he called was the faculty of psychology. Okay. Now, what is this faculty of psychology? This faculty of psychology basically is this loosely held set of beliefs that maintains that the mind is composed of very many different sorts of special purpose components. If you remember one of the earlier classes, I have been talking about what are the different mental functions that the mind undertakes. Each of these different mental functions can actually, if you want, theoretically be these different modules. So, imagination could be a module. In that imagination, visual imagination could be a module, auditory or otherwise imagination could be a module, or say for example understanding shapes could be a module, your ability of reasoning could be a module. So, these kind of things Jerry Fodor actually began discussing. Marshall basically in 1984 says that the basis of these ideas that Fodor was putting forward in 1983 basically were could be traced back to the ancient Greek times of the Greek philosopher Aristotle. Just a quick flashback to what Aristotle was saying. So, Aristotle's framework basically he talked about thinking quite a lot, and his framework for thinking basically starts with these considerations of the 5 senses. So, he says that there are 5 senses that we have: sight, sound, touch, smell and taste, and each of these 5 senses map on to these respective sense organs. Okay. For the sight we have eye, we have ear, we have the skin, we have the nose and we have the tongue for each of these different senses respectively. Eventually these are the senses which do sensory encoding of whatever information is coming in, and then sensory transduction, which is basically converting of this sensory information to a form that can be processed by the brain. Jerry Fodor, drawing from what Aristotle had talked about, proposed 2 kinds of faculties, 2 kinds of abilities that the human mind or the human brain, you might say, will have. The first kind of faculties proposed by Jerry Fodor were the horizontal faculties. Okay. He labeled the faculties of perception, imagination, reasoning and memory as horizontal faculties. Now, what is a horizontal faculty? Let us elaborate. Horizontal faculties basically reflect the general competencies, okay, whatever the brain generally does on all kinds of information. Okay. So, for example, whatever processing really cuts across different domains. I was talking about color and those kind of things. What all the brain does on every information that comes in, those kind of those kind of abilities could come up under this horizontal faculties category. Say for instance, cognitive abilities may be conceived as a containing a memory component, all cognitive abilities that is, and therefore memory can be construed as a horizontal faculty. Even if I am talking about talking to you about language, if I am talking to you about reasoning, if I am talking to you about imagery, all of these will necessarily have a component of memory. Say for example, if I ask you to describe the world in 20 sentences, you will definitely use your memory to talk about it. So, language has a memory connection. If I talk to you about, let us say, deciding something, you will actually say, for example, the mental arithmetic example that we took in one of the earlier classes, comparing 17 into 3 and 14 into 5. You will do some computation and from your memory hold these results and then compare. So, that also has a component of a memory. Okay. So, this is the way in which these different faculties were supposed to be involved in whatever the brain is doing, and in that sense at a generic level. And these generic abilities were clubbed under this category called horizontal faculties. Okay, so memory in that sense can be construed as a horizontal faculty insofar as memory constraints apply to other and quite unrelated competencies, such as say for example trying to learn a poem poem by heart. You will need to read the first line, second line, third line, hold it, then read the fourth and the fifth line, hold it, and then try and recite it back. So, it anyways does have a memory component involved here. According to Jerry Fodor, horizontal faculties then can be defined with respect to what they do and not defined in terms of what they operate on. Okay, these are general processors. These are not concerned with say for example what they are processing. Similar to if you remember we were talking about information processing in the last lecture. We were talking about how Shannon and Weaver visualize the information processing system. They were not really concerned with what is this information processing system transmitting and receiving. They were concerned with what could be the parameters, what are the components of the information processing system. Similarly, Jerry Fodor said that horizontal faculties basically are defined with respect to what they are doing, not with respect to what they are operating on. Okay. So, this is one of the ways in which we can think of horizontal faculties. Another kind of faculties Jerry Fodor actually defined or put forward was that of vertical faculties. What are vertical faculties? Vertical faculties basically are the different kinds of information that are coming that will be later operated upon by the horizontal faculties. Now, inspiration for this for Jerry Fodor probably came from the work of a French physician, Franz Joseph Gall, and Gall had a very interesting conceptualization of the human mind. Gall's idea was that the mind is composed of a distinct mental organ, and each mental organ was defined with respect to a specific content domain. Okay, I'll elaborate on this as we move ahead. Say for instance, there could be a mental organ that underlies musical ability, okay, and a different mental organ that underlies mathematical ability, and a different mental organ, let us say, that underlies sports ability. Okay, so Joseph Gall was actually, or Franz Gall was actually thinking at that point in time that each ability is associated with a specific organ in the brain, and that is how he conceptualized or actually divided the whole brain into separate portions which do this. So we'll let us just talk about that in some sense. Gall actually takes this argument slightly further and proposes that each of these different mental faculties or mental organs could be identified within a unique region of the brain. Okay, and he firmly believed in this idea. So what he did was he basically divided the brain into these particular bumps. He said there are these different bumps in the brain, structural points in the brain, which could be interpreted as being associated with particular mental abilities. Okay. Each of these regions would embody a particular intellectual capability, and the prominence of the bump, how prominent it is and how does it appear, basically would indicate the size of the underlying brain region. Say for example, if there is a very important mental function, let us say the ability to do good math, maybe the underlying region or the bump associated with the ability of doing math should be slightly larger as compared if you think that music is a simpler ability. So the region of the brain devoted to the musical ability would be slightly smaller. Okay, let us in that sense see if here in this you can see that this is what the conception of Franz Gall was, that these are these different regions, and each of these different regions of the brain are doing something or the other. Okay, this is what Franz Gall said way back in the 1700s, 1800s. Okay. Now, in positing these vertical faculties, Gall basically provided a critique of the traditional view of horizontal faculties. So, he basically said kind of posed this as a conflict between what the horizontal faculties are and what the vertical faculties are. Now, what did he do with this was that this general notion of faculties for memory, perception, etc. Was dismissed in favor of a framework for thinking in which a whole battery of distinct mental organ are posited. Okay, in which each one has particular characteristics with respect to memory, perception, etc. So, he is saying that let us better divide the brain not into general abilities like the horizontal faculties, let us talk about vertical faculties which are specific processes, and each of these specific processes has a component for memory, has a component for perception, and in that sense. So, imitation, if you notice the last figure, should have a component of memory because you would remember what you want to imitate, and has a component for deciding and stuff like that. Okay. So, Gall's vertical faculties in that sense, they do not share, and hence they do not compete with the horizontal resources for memory or attention or intelligence, etc. Okay, so there is this conflict between what these general purpose mental faculties or horizontal faculties were, or these special purpose mental faculties or these vertical faculties was. This is something which Gall was talking about. Coming back to what Fodor really wanted us to think. Okay, so Fodor wrote this book, The Modularity of Mind, in 1983, and a slightly different meaning of modules was introduced by Jerry Fodor. Okay, he basically distinguished between what the sensory transducers are, what are these input systems, and what are the central processors. Okay, you can think of about this in a way that there is certain information in the world, and that information received by you by virtue of these sensory organs, which then convert this information into a form in which the brain can actually deal with it. So, that is the process of sensory transduction. Once that information is converted into a common form after sensory transduction, that information has to be acted upon by the other higher areas of the brain, which is your central processors. So, take this example, hold this example with you and then use it to understand what we are going to talk about, what Fodor meant with modularity. Okay. So, in order to understand these, one of the concepts introduced by Fodor was the concept of a proximal stimulus and the concept of a distal stimulus. The proximal stimulus basically is what is happening at the sense organs, what is the stimulation that is being received at the sense organs. this distal stimulus will be what is the actual object that is creating this proximal stimulation. Say for example, a distal stimulus could be a stereo system which is playing, let us say, in the next room or in the same room slightly distant from you, and the associated proximal stimulus would be the sound vibrations that you eventually receive on the ear. So, the proximal stimulation could vary if the stereo is kept very close to you versus if the stereo is kept rather far from you. The sensory transducers, which the sense organs are responsible for taking this proximal stimulus and converting them into a basic sensory code, which will be worked upon by the sensory transducers. Now, this code then acts as an input to the corresponding input system. Say, let us say there is an input system that processes auditory information. Now, for Fodor, these input systems are the modules that were referred to in the modularity hypothesis. If you remember what Marr was also saying, these modules have to interact as an interface between the sensory transducers and the central processors. Okay, these will be the subunits that we will be working with. Okay. So, the final decision about what was the distal stimulus, say for example, if somebody asked you to judge a song that was playing on this stereo. So, what was the distal stimulus maybe has to be made by the central processors. Okay. So, these central processors are concerned with the fixation of belief and planning of intelligent action. Say for example, if a nice song is being played, something that you want to really hear, so then maybe you will shift all your attention to it, or something unpleasant is being played and you want to go and stop it, that kind of decision has to be taken by what the central processor is. This fixation of central belief or this fixation of perceptual belief actually is this act of making a final decision about the distal stimulus. That is what the main job of the central processors would be. This is a visualization of this entire process. You can see that there is a distal stimulus and there is a proximal stimulus, and then you can see that the end of this entire thing is the central processor, which will finally decide how you react to this information. All this really interesting thing about thinking, whether you've whether you like something or not, whether you've heard this before or not, those kind of decisions basically are taken by what the central processors are. Fodor in 2000 also claimed that the operation of central processors actually remains essentially unknown. Okay, this black box is still not really clear. In 2000, so for example, much ahead, after this modularity hypothesis was proposed, still it kind of remains unknown to us. Let's try and make sense of what these modules are. Fodor says that these modules which are functioning are domain specific. Okay, there are many more modules than sense organs. So, the visual system may contain more than one module. Say for example, there could be one module about color, one module processing depth, one module processing shapes and contours. So, the entire visual processing system is not a single module, it can also be divided into many sub modules. Okay. Similarly, say for example, in the domain of language processing, there could be a couple of modules, one which deals with written language, one visual language, or one which deals with spoken language, that is auditory language. A recent take on this basically has been taken by Max Coltheart, where he says that a cognitive system is domain specific if it only responds to stimuli of a particular kind. We will discuss a lot of experiments as we go ahead. One of these examples that we will come across is a particular area of the brain which responds only to words, which is called the visual word form area, or a particular area of the brain which responds only to faces, which is your fusiform face area. So, these could be thought of as modules that actually deal with only a particular and a specific kind of stimulus. Okay. Now, let us try and apply this whole concept of modularity to how the brain is actually supposed to function. Okay. Let us talk about what is called modularity and cognitive neuropsychology. Fodor proposed that these modules are associated with fixed neural architecture, okay, of the adult human brain. So, this the human brain can be divided functionally into these different modules. Modules exhibit characteristics and specific breakdown patterns. Okay. Say for example, there could be a module about color processing that might go away, there could be a module about speech production that might go away, in that kind of sense. Now, if we accept the above 2 points which we are conceding, that modules have a fixed neural structure and modules can have specific characteristics of breakdown, etc., then what we are trying to do is we are actually assuming a rather critical dependency between the mind and the brain. Okay, this is a very interesting part to which cognitive neuropsychology, really helps us. If now, if the brain is damaged, just taking this example further, if the brain is damaged, then it is very likely that there will be negative consequences for a particular module that was associated with that region of the brain. Okay, and I think this might be, you might have heard of different people sometimes undergoing, things like a stroke or some things like, accidents in which particular and specific abilities are lost. Memory loss happens, or loss of language happens, loss of particular kinds of visual capabilities happen. All of those kind of things are happening, consequent to a brain damage. So there is that relationship between the mind and the brain there to be seen. Now, what is cognitive neuropsychology? Cognitive neuropsychology basically, or let us say what cognitive neuropsychologists are concerned with, is the operation of disordered brains, brains which have particular kinds of defects, and the assumption here is that much can be learned about this cognitive system or what the mind is when you actually look at the brains which are not functioning normally. You can look at a broken machine and you can think about this part is not working and this thing is not happening. So, this part is related to that particular kind of an output. This is the kind of relation that we try to maintain or try to deduce when you are actually talking about cognitive neuropsychology. This evidence from these brain damaged individuals, the patients in various hospitals, can actually provide us converging evidence for particular functional accounts, and may also provide us critical constraints for such accounts. Say for example, you thought that area A was involved in reading and area B was involved in speaking, and you come across a patient in which area A is damaged, but the person is able to read completely accurately. It will help you remove that assumption that area A was linked to reading. That can happen. Another flavor of cognitive neuropsychology is developmental neuropsychology. Developmental neuropsychology is the branch of cognitive neuropsychology which basically deals with brain disorders that develop as a person ages, and that lead to some form of cognitive impairment, that is developmental disorders. There are also acquired disorders that occur during the normal course of development, sometimes through injury or different kinds of illnesses, say for example encephalitis or stroke, etc. An example could be some people could acquire aphasia, that is loss of language, or a particular loss of a particular component of language due to stroke or other kinds of illnesses. Now, in adopting this cognitive neuropsychological approach, the theorist basically attempts to understand the cognitive deficits following particular or specific kinds of brain damage. One of the things that one does is accept certain key assumptions. What are those assumptions? Let us say one of those are, say for example, as Coulthard said, you have to have the foundational assumption that some functional architecture is operating across all normal individuals. Something, say for example eyes, or there is a particular area of the brain, let us say area V1 of the occipital cortex, which is the part of the brain which processes visual input, operates in all the individuals. There should be nobody who actually sees through the frontal cortex. Okay, that basic assumption one would have to maintain to have any theory about how this mind and brain relationship really works. According to Coulthard, as he says, that cognitive neuropsychology would actually simply fail if different individuals had different functional architectures for the same cognitive domain, the example which I just gave. Also, you have to remember that if we are trying to pursue cognitive psychology, then we are trying to establish a general general principles that will apply across all individuals. The whole idea of this field is that we are actually deducing theories which would apply to all individuals. If things were so that there were so many individual differences and each brain is completely different from each other from another brain, then it will be very difficult to really generate any general purpose theory which would apply across individuals. Now, the logic behind cognitive neuropsychology is very simple. Cognitive neuropsychologists are primarily concerned with patterns and similarities and differences between normal cognitive abilities and the abilities of these people who have a disordered or a damaged brain. What is what are the specific abilities of a person with damage in area X of the brain, and what is the cognitive ability of the person who does not have damage in area X, and how does he perform on a particular task. We try and compare this. Okay. So typically the interest is in the performance across a whole battery of tests. Generally a whole battery of tests is given which will test different aspects of a particular cognitive function, and the performance of these two individuals, one with a damage in area X and one without a damage in area X, are tested and compared on these critical parameters. That is how you come to know that acha, area X was involved in this specific kind of ability under the umbrella of this particular cognitive function. Now, cognitive neuropsychology in that sense is slightly distinctive because it really also talks about some in detailed analysis of single case studies. Okay. Say for example, it compares the performance of participants with brain damage to that of, say for example, if there is a patient who has damage, as I was saying earlier, in area X, how does his performance compare to the performance of other normal individuals. So, we do invest proper importance in single cases as well. Okay. Now, there could be two kinds of deficits which you find in cognitive neuropsychology. Let us talk a bit about that. First kind of deficits is your association deficits. Say for example, if there is a patient who performs poorly on say two different tasks, say for example in understanding written words and in understanding spoken words, these are two different tasks. Okay. Now, this pair of impairments can be said to be associated because they are arising in the same function, same person. Okay. There is the same person who cannot understand written words and who cannot understand spoken words. Now, it might be tempting also to conclude that the performance in both these tests depend on the operation of a single underlying function. So, what you can easily say language is basically involved in both understanding written words and understanding spoken words. So, this person should have a problem with language. That is why this kind of thing is happening, but there is more to that. We will talk about that in a while. Another kind of deficit that one could talk about is the dissociation deficit. Say for example, Funnell in 1983 reports one particular patient who was able to read aloud more than 90% of the words, but was unable to read aloud even the simplest of non-words. Now, what is a non-word? Non-word is something that is that arrangement of words that can be pronounced but does not have any meaning. Okay. So, there could be a person who is being able to read aloud all the words, but not being able to read aloud any non-word. Why should this happen? What is that critical thing missing in this person be? In such cases, what we assume is that these abilities are said to be dissociated. Okay. Reading of non-words and reading of words are said to be dissociated within the same, because within the same person one is impaired, but the other is intact. Now, this deficit on the two tasks in question could also be that of degree. So, for example, he could read 50% non-words, not all the non-words. Okay. That could also be one of the things to consider. Now, let us look at these two examples or these two kinds of deficits slightly more closely. In terms of our single dissociation example, you have a case of two tasks that may either arise because of the operation of two different modules, one which understands written words, one which understands spoken words. Or we can think of a non-modular system that contains a single resource, okay, in which basically both of the functions are implied. Okay. So, there is a single resource which both helps you understand written words and understand spoken words. In explaining of the single dissociation, then what we can say is that we can easily accept a modular explanation, okay, but it can also be explained through a non-modular design, okay, as I said in the example just now. So, you can apply a modular explanation that a single module was subserving these two functions, that is why the single associated deficit, or you could say both these modules have been damaged in the same person, that is why something is happening. So, a modular versus a non-modular explanation are both feasible here. But say for example, another way of looking at this is that maybe the two tasks are not equated in their inherent difficulty. Okay, so that the single dissociation may merely reflect the different demands on a single resource, as I was talking about a modular design. We can assume that the dissociation, that this dissociation is showing that task A performance is unimpaired or relatively unimpaired, because whereas task B performance is showing a substantial deficit. Okay, reading written words or understanding spoken words. Now, by the resource argument, this can happen if task A is a easier task than task B. So, if the same ability is damaged, and the demands on this ability or the demands on this resource is more by task A and less by task B. So, you can say that task A will be damaged, but task B will still be there because it is putting less demands on this single resource. Okay. As I just said, so task A makes fewer demands on the resources than does task B. So, any damage that results in the depletion of mental resources will have a more catastrophic impact on task B than task A, okay, or will have a more catastrophic impact on the more difficult task, the one which makes more demands. Okay. Now, try and understand, let us try and understand the double dissociation, what is happening in double dissociation. A firmer evidence for mental modules arises when we consider the notion of double dissociations. Okay. Say for example, if you find a patient in which there are two tasks, task A and task B, and you have two patients, patient 1 and patient 2. Okay. So, what can happen is, say for example, a double dissociation will arise if in one case patient 1 performs well on task A, but performs worse on task B, and patient B performs worse on task A and well on task B. So, you have this kind of a dissociation that there is in the same person, task A is fine, task B is damaged, and on the other person task B is fine and task A is damaged. So, by comparison of these data from these two participants, you can actually deduce that there is no way that task A and task 2 are linked, and in that sense you have to accept the modular explanation that task A and task B are being subserved by two different modules. Make sense? Now, Coulthard basically gives an example, it takes the example of a patient in 2001, and he says that patient A is impaired in comprehending printed words, but normal at comprehending spoken words, and patient B is normal at comprehending printed words, but impaired at comprehending spoken words. So, this kind of a pattern of deficit basically provides you good grounds for concluding that the different modules are underlying text comprehension and speech comprehension respectively. Okay. More specifically, the double dissociation basically is most consistent with the idea is that at least one module that is unique to comprehending either printed words or spoken words is slightly different. Okay. So, at least one module is unique and there is a unique model that talks about spoken words. Okay. Moreover, in the case of double dissociation, such a double dissociation you cannot explain away in terms of only resource allocation. You cannot say that task A was slightly less difficult and task B was more difficult. That is why this pattern of deficits have emerged. So, in simple terms, say for example, if task A had demanded fewer resources than B, as we saw, task A performance can remain intact even if task B performance was impaired. Okay. Now, if that is possible, but still a reverse pattern will not occur if the problem is assumed to lie in only the allocation of resources in a single non-modular system, something which is happening with the double dissociation case. Okay. Any problems in resource allocation will hurt the difficult task first. Okay. Say for example, if you said that task A was difficult, task B was easy, then the other in the other example in which task A is damaged and task B is not, you cannot explain that. Okay, because if it is a single resource, then the more difficult task will be affected first. But we saw in the case of patient B that different task was damaged, but this more difficult task was spared. So, that you cannot really explain by using a single modular design. That kind of forces you to explain or accept the explanation based on two different modules. Coulthard actually takes this and he says that this by no means however is definitive proof of modular architecture. Okay. For example, double dissociation can arise in cases where different impairments or the same unified information system is there. But for now we will actually just accept the two explanations we forwarded of associated deficits and dissociated deficits and how they can actually help you deduce whether a particular ability is served by a common module or by two different modules. Okay. Now, just to sum up the lecture for today, we talked about various possible architectures of the mind using the modularity examples from David Marr and also from Jerry Fodor. We talked about also how cognitive neuropsychology can help us understand the nature of the relationship between the mind and the brain. Okay, thank you.